bring you some breaking news coming out of the occupied West Bank. There's been a ramming and shooting incident just south of occupied East Jerusalem. According to Israeli reports, at least 3 Israeli settlers have been injured near the Nafaq checkpoint. For more on this, let's bring in Hamdah Salhut. She's joining us from Amman. So what are you hearing about this incident?
Well, medical authorities are saying that the 3 Israeli settlers who were injured are in moderate to light condition, saying that the assailant of the ramming attack was neutralized by nearby security forces. So what we know is that this was a ramming attack. They say that the person who was operating the car drove into the settlers at a known hitchhiking spot in the occupied West Bank. The incident occurring in an area between Beit Lahem and the occupied West Bank near a checkpoint leading to occupied East Jerusalem. Security officials say they are now at the scene and are investigating.
Hamdah, just give us an idea of the significance of this location. It's in occupied Palestinian territory. What is its proximity to the checkpoint, the settlements there?
Well, it is pretty close to occupied East Jerusalem. These checkpoints run through the occupied West Bank to try and get you to occupied East Jerusalem. These are areas that Palestinians frequent often to try and get from the occupied city to the occupied territory. And we've now seen sort of this upward trend in attacks within the last month or so. And previously, when Israel's war on Gaza began, we didn't see as many of them, but there were quite a few before the war had happened. But this one in particular seemed to have been targeting Israeli settlers in and around the occupied West Bank. Let's not forget there are illegal settlements all throughout the occupied territory, which are deemed illegal under international law.
And Hamdah, just to put everything into context and perspective, this is coming amidst quite a history of violence in the West Bank, with human rights organizations like Amnesty International talking about waves of violence in which it appears the Israeli military has backed these settlers as they attack West Bank Palestinian occupied towns and villages, right? Just put it into perspective for us that this is part of a bigger picture of tension.
Well, earlier this year, in around March, the UN said that they were already on track for the highest number of violent settler attacks against Palestinians. We are now nearing October, and that number has skyrocketed. Israeli settlers have carried out numerous attacks under the protection of Israeli forces. Palestinians essentially left defenseless in the face of multiple threats, whether it's the occupation, whether it's the Israeli military raiding their towns, or whether it's violent Israeli settlers trying to steal their livestock, take their land, and assault them. These types of attacks often go unchecked, often go unnoticed, and often go without any sort of consequence for those who are perpetrating it. This is why Palestinians feel defenseless in the occupied territory. You not only have the largest number and scale of Israeli military incursions into the West Bank since Israel's war on Gaza began, but since the beginning of this year specifically in the northern part of the occupied territory, where refugee camps are essentially getting leveled to the ground. It's the highest number of displaced Palestinians in the West Bank since the occupation began decades ago. And in the south, near Hebron, you have Israeli settlers who are regularly assaulting Palestinians. You have a number of Palestinians this year alone who have been killed by Israeli settlers. This is the highest number of Palestinians who have been killed by Israeli settlers, according to the UN. Since the start of the year, more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed by either Israeli forces or armed Israeli settlers alone.
And this comes at a sensitive time, Hamdah, when we've just had this peace plan outlined by the US president along with Israel's prime minister, right?
Look, tensions are certainly high, and they have been since the war began. Across the West Bank, you now have more than 900 checkpoints across the occupied territory, and that's because of the increasing Israeli military incursions. So the tightening of restrictions on Palestinians in the West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem has been described as suffocating by the people who live there, saying that they are under immense stress and danger, not just from Israeli forces alone, but also from Israeli settlers. And while we are on the heels of some sort of ceasefire deal to a potential peace plan, there are still a lot of people who, one, don't agree with the war ending, or two, want to see a different outcome, not just in Gaza, but for the Palestinians who live in the West Bank. Because remember, throughout the entire time the war on Gaza has been going on, the Israeli military opened up a completely different and separate front in the occupied West Bank, sieging towns, killing Palestinians, leveling refugee camps. And these operations are still going on. You have tens of thousands of Palestinians who are displaced in the West Bank. You have Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem who really don't know how to live because of the occupation. The consequences of Israel's military occupation on the Palestinian people are far-reaching and often described as a collective punishment to all of the people when one person decides to take any sort of action. So while we're discussing a potential ceasefire plan, while we are discussing all of this, it doesn't take away from the fact that Israel is still expanding illegal settlements in the occupied territory, that they are trying to stop any sort of prospect of a Palestinian state from happening. And that's what Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying in light of many Western nations recognizing Palestine as a state.
And Hamdah, in addition to the sort of physical measures you've mentioned there that strangle life in the West Bank for occupied Palestinians, we heard again the last 24 hours from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking against the establishment of a Palestinian state. We heard him make that message as well, deliver that message at the UN. How does that strangle the hopes for any political horizon for Palestinians to achieve their right of self-determination, national self-determination?
While many Palestinians welcome the fact that members of the international community are recognizing their right to self-determination, it's important to remember that there's still this level of skepticism. Is anything going to change on the ground? Are there actually going to be measures taken for that self-determination, for the establishment of a state, for the people to have the country that they lost after the occupation? And Benjamin Netanyahu said that once he arrives back from the United States and he's on his way back to Israel to meet with his cabinet, that he's going to announce countermeasures as a result of many Western nations who decided to recognize Palestine at the UN General Assembly or in the days leading up to it. Benjamin Netanyahu said that he has spent the entirety of his political career trying to block this very establishment, trying to block Palestine from becoming a state next to Israel. And he and his right-wing government say that it's simply not going to happen because they are mulling annexation of the occupied West Bank, something that his biggest ally, U.S. President Donald Trump, said simply isn't going to happen. But members of the settler movement, members of the right wing, said that they were kind of disturbed after meeting with Netanyahu in New York just a couple of days ago, saying that they didn't get an answer from him. And that's because President Trump's answer was quite clear, that it's not going to happen. It would cause a lot of regional tensions. It's a red line for every single Arab and Gulf state who is an ally of the United States. So it puts the U.S. at a tricky point when the Israelis want to take such a move, when the United States is against it, and the international community is upping this pressure on the Israelis. So there are so many moving parts here. But what we are going to see on the ground, perhaps, is not really much when it comes to the establishment of a Palestinian state just yet.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much to Hamdah Salhut reporting to us from Amman in Jordan on our, let me just recap the headline in case you're just joining us. The breaking news coming out of the occupied West Bank, talking about a shooting and ramming attack just south of occupied East Jerusalem. And apparently 3 Israeli settlers have been injured so far, is the word that we're hearing. All of this happening near a Nafaq checkpoint. And this is, of course, not the first time we've seen these kinds of incidents of tension in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Don't miss out and get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insight. Like, share, stay ahead.